Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G. Welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. The date is May 22nd, 1856. The place? The floor of the United States Senate, a chamber supposedly dedicated to reasoned debate. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, a staunch abolitionist, is at his desk signing copies of his recent speech, The Crime Against Kansas. He had viciously attacked the institution of slavery and its defenders, including Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Suddenly, a figure looms over him. It's Representative Preston Brooks, Senator Butler's kinsman. Brooks' voice is low and steady. Quote, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Before Sumner can react, Brooks raises a thick gutta percha cane with a heavy gold head, and he brings it down with full force on Sumner's skull, again, and then again. Blinded by his own blood, Sumner struggles to rise, his long legs trapped beneath his desk, which is bolted to the floor. With a mighty roar, he rips the desk from its iron moorings, staggers into the aisle. But the beating doesn't stop. Brooks continues to rain down blows, the cane shattering into splinters until Sumner collapses, unconscious and bleeding profusely on the Senate floor. Brooks would later boast of delivering, quote, about 30 first-rate stripes, end quote. Stunned onlookers, including other Southern congressmen who blocked anyone from intervening, simply watched. This savage assault was more than a personal vendetta, which it was. But it was a symbol of what the nation had become. It represented, as one historian put it, the, quote, breakdown of reasoned discourse, end quote. How did the United States, a nation founded on ideals of liberty and debate, arrive at a point where political differences were settled with a cane on the floors of the Senate? This brings us to one of the great debates among historians of the Civil War. Was this conflict, as New York Senator William Seward famously declared, an irrepressible conflict between two societies so fundamentally different that war was inevitable? Or was it, as a later group of revisionist historians like James C. Randall and Avery Craven argued, a repressible conflict, a needless war brought on by a, quote, blundering generation of extremist politicians who failed to find compromise that could have saved the Union? Today, we'll explore the questions by examining the decade-long fuse, that 1850s decade, that was lit by compromise and it ended in war. So let's go. So how did we get here? Well, we've seen throughout this entire course how we've got here, obviously. But today's story is actually going to begin not with violence, but in 1850 with an attempt to avoid violence. The Union by 1850 was in peril. The vast territory acquired from Mexico had thrown the nation into a crisis over the future of slavery. California, like we mentioned last episode, was flooded now with settlers from the gold rush, and California, now that it had the population necessary to do so, was demanding admission as a state and a free state, and once again threatened to shatter the delicate balance of power between North and South in the Senate. Into this breach stepped the giants of a fading political generation. At the center was Henry Clay of Kentucky, the aging great compromiser who rose to offer one last grand bargain to save the nation. Quote, "It is a work of mutual concession, a work in which, for the sake of peace and concord, one party abates his extreme demands in consideration of an abatement of extreme demands by the other party. Let us discard all resentment, all passions. Let us go to the altar of our country and swear, as the oath was taken of old, that we will preserve her union." End quote. But Clay's plea for unity was met with a grim prophecy. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, so frail at this point from tuberculosis that he had to have his speech read by a colleague, delivered a haunting warning. The North's relentless attacks on slavery, he argued, had already destroyed the Union's equilibrium. Quote, "I have senators believed from the first that the agitation of the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. Entertaining this opinion, I have, on all proper occasions, endeavored to call the attention of both the two great parties, but without success. The agitation has been permitted to proceed until it can no longer be disguised or denied that the Union is in danger." End quote. Slavery, in his other words, was breaking the Union. Out of this crucible of hope and despair emerged the Great Compromise of 1850. And great is in quotation marks, and it definitely was not that. It wasn't a single bill, but it was a package of 5 separate laws cleverly steered through Congress by the rising political star Stephen Douglas of Illinois. It was a classic political bargain with something for everybody. To put it very plainly, California becomes admitted as a free state. Popular sovereignty, the will of the people, would determine whether or not new territories, when applying for statehood, could become free or slave states. And this was to be used in Utah and New Mexico. It set Texas's boundaries while also settling its debt that it had assumed during the wars. The slave trade was also banned in Washington, D.C. But the most contentious part of this compromise contained what historian David Potter has argued was the poison chalice. The one piece of the bargain that the South demanded above all others, a new draconian Fugitive Slave Act, would provide and prove to be the very thing that made this compromise unsustainable long term. This new fugitive slave law was breathtaking in its severity. It denied accused fugitives the right to a jury trial or even to testify in their own defense. Federal commissioners were paid more for returning a person to slavery than for setting them free. That could be a problem, as I'm sure you can see. Maybe most explosively, it demanded that all citizens, including Northerners, were by law required to actively assist in the capture of alleged runaways. Any person found not assisting or impeding on the capture of runaway or alleged runaway slaves was fined with heavy fines and even prison sentences, even if you just aided in their escape. The South had demanded this law to secure what it called its property rights, a key condition for them to remain in the Union. Yet its enforcement had a profoundly radicalizing effect on the North. It dragged the reality of slavery, for many Northerners had been a distant, abstract institution, into their neighborhoods, into their town squares. The sight of federal marshals seizing people, some of whom have lived as free members of their communities for years, and sending them back to the South without due process, turned many moderates into staunch opponents of the slave power. Northern states passed what they called personal liberty laws to obstruct the federal act, which in turn convinced Southerners that the North would never honor its constitutional obligations. The very measure designed to secure the Union became the most powerful force driving it apart. Northerners were exercising what they called states' rights to not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Southerners became so upset at this that they demanded that the federal government enforce the Fugitive Slave Act against the will of the Northerners. An irony not lost on Northerners when Southern states said that they were defending their states' rights to slavery. If a law demanded you violate your conscience, would you obey it? The Fugitive Slave Act forced that question upon the North, and in 1852, a novel written by a minister's wife, Harriet Beecher Stowe, turned that political question into a national moral crisis. She wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this wasn't just a book, it was a cultural earthquake. It sold over 300,000 copies in its first year. The novel's power lay in its ability to move the debate from the halls of Congress into the hearts of its readers. It personalized the horrors of slavery. It focused on the emotional traumas of family separation, the conflict between human law and God's law. This is captured perfectly in the scene where the wife of a senator, Mrs. Bird, learns of the Fugitive Slave Act her husband just voted for. Quote, "You ought to be ashamed, John. Poor, homeless, houseless creatures. It is shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it for one the first time I get a chance, and I hope I have a chance. I do." End quote. This sentiment that Mrs. Bird said, this higher moral law that trumped the laws of the state, electrified the North, and it terrified the South. Stowe's novel reframes slavery not as a political issue to be compromised over, but as a national sin that demanded absolute opposition and eventually reckoning. In response, the South didn't just defend its institution, it built an entire counter-morality movement around it. Southern intellectuals, like ones we have met, George Fitzhugh, argued that slavery was not the necessary evil but a positive good. In fact, his 1850 work, The Universal Law of Slavery, Fitzhugh made the stunning claim that Southern slaves were in fact, quote, "the happiest and in some senses freest people in the world," end quote. Why would he say something like this? Because unlike the Northern wage slave, in his estimation, who were exploited by capitalists and abandoned when sick or old, enslaved persons were cared for throughout their entire lives. This argument created two irreconcilable moral universes. On one side, slavery was a soul-crushing sin. On the other, it was a benevolent paternalistic system. Political skill, no matter how great, could not and cannot bridge a chasm that wide. The conflict was becoming truly irrepressible. As we've seen, the Compromise of 1850 was a failed attempt to calm the waters of this national debate. And they would come to a head once more a few years later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and this was itself a political hurricane. The architect of this storm was Senator Stephen Douglas, who we had talked about previously. He was known as the Little Giant from Illinois. His great ambition was a transcontinental railroad that would bind the nation together, with its eastern terminus in his home state. To achieve this, he needed to organize the vast Nebraska territory west of Missouri. His solution was a concept that he called popular sovereignty. Quote, "The great principle is the right of every community to judge and decide for itself whether a thing is right or wrong. I deny the right of Congress to force a slaveholding state upon an unwilling people. I deny their right to force a free state upon an unwilling people. Leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way." End quote. To Douglas, this was the essence of democracy. But to make it happen, his Kansas-Nebraska Act explicitly had to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which, for the previous 34 years, had prohibited slavery in this very territory he wanted organized. The political explosion of this was immediate and it was catastrophic. It actually shattered the Whig Party and it split it along sectional lines. And from the ashes rose a new political force, a party founded on a single potent idea of stopping the expansion of slavery. This was the birth of the Republican Party. But the true test of popular sovereignty came not in Washington, but actually on the plains of Kansas. The territory itself became the test of popular sovereignty and what some historians call the first shots of the Civil War. Pro-slavery supporters, they were called border ruffians, had stormed across the border from Missouri to stuff ballot boxes and terrorize violently any anti-slavery settlers who might vote for this to become a free state. In response, abolitionist societies like the New England Emigrant Aid Company funded the migration of what they called free soilers to the territory to vote to make it a free state. The result, of course, as you can see, was not democracy. It was civil war. Julia Lovejoy, an abolitionist settler who moved to Kansas with her family, chronicled the horror in letters to Eastern newspapers. Quote, Our hearts sicken at the atrocities perpetuated daily upon the innocent and unoffending. Osawatomie has been laid in ashes, every house burned, and 4 of our men killed. 50 Osawatomie families, shelterless, are now living in their wagons in the woods, endeavoring to escape these fiends in human form, heaven and Elijah's ravens to feed on them. End quote. Soon Kansas would have 2 rival governments, a pro-slavery one in Lecompton and a free state one in Topeka, and a guerrilla war raged across the territory. This is what we know today as Bleeding Kansas. And this became a national spectacle. It was a terrifying microcosm of the larger conflict over slavery. It proved that popular sovereignty, Douglas's democratic solution, was a failure, and not just a failure, but a bloody failure. The North and the South were no longer willing to vote on the future of slavery. They were willing to kill for it. After the political process failed so spectacularly in Kansas, many hoped the nation's highest legal authority, the Supreme Court, could resolve this crisis in some manner. In 1857, it was given that chance. The case of an enslaved man named Dred Scott provided such an opportunity. Scott had been taken by his enslaver into the Free State of Illinois and then the Free Wisconsin Territory, and he sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence on free soil made him free. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, or Taney as it's pronounced, was a Southerner, and he saw a chance not just to rule on Scott's case, but to settle the slavery question forever. The decision he wrote would become one of the most reviled in American history. The court's ruling was a sweeping 3-part bombshell. First, it declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. He wrote that they were, quote, beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect, end quote. Second, the court ruled that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. Congress, he argued, had no authority to ban slavery from any federal territory. Third, he argued that enslaved people were property, and the Fifth Amendment protected a slaveholder's right to that property anywhere in these United States. The impact of this court decision, the highest court in the land, was seismic. For the South, it was a total victory, a judicial confirmation of their most extreme constitutional arguments. For the newly formed Republican Party, it was a disaster. The court had just declared their entire platform, the prevention of slavery's expansion, to be unconstitutional. More than that, the Dred Scott decision destroyed what little faith the North had left in the federal government. To many, it looked like a coordinated conspiracy by a slave power that now controlled the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land had not acted as a neutral arbiter of the law. It acted as a partisan weapon for the South. With the political and legal avenues for compromise seemingly exhausted, the path to a violent resolution only grew. The Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case did lead to violence, and it radicalized a man named John Brown. John Brown was a man forged in the fires of Bleeding Kansas. He was a religious zealot who believed he was God's chosen instrument to destroy slavery. In October of 1859, John Brown and a small band of 21 followers, including both black and white adherents, launched a daring raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His plan was audacious and desperate: seize the arsenal's 100,000 rifles, arm local slaves, and spark a massive rebellion that would sweep through the South, ending slavery in a tide of blood. The raid was an ultimate failure. Local slaves did not rise up, and within 36 hours, Brown's forces were cornered in an engine house by the U.S. Marines under the command of a man named Colonel Robert E. Lee. John Brown's true impact came not in battle, but in his trial and later martyrdom. His final speech to the court was a masterpiece of defiant eloquence that transformed him from a failed revolutionary into a prophetic figure. Quote, "I deny everything but what I have all along admitted of a design on my part to free slaves. I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave countries whose rights are disgraced by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done." End quote. The nation was utterly polarized by his actions and his words. In the South, the raid was a confirmation of their deepest fears. They saw Brown as a terrorist, the living embodiment of the violent Northern abolitionist fanaticism, sent to murder them in their beds while they slept. The Richmond Enquirer declared that the raid had, quote, "advanced the cause of disunion more than any other event," end quote. In the North, the reaction was more complex. While many condemned his violence, a powerful and influential group, including figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, hailed him as a saint and a martyr. No one captured this shift better than Frederick Douglass. Douglass, the former slave, had met with Brown before the raid and called the plan a steel trap, refusing to join him. But after Brown's execution, Douglass embraced the John Brown way, as he called it. He argued that moral appeals had failed and that slaveholders would only respond to fear and possibly later violence. Quote, "We must reach the slaveholder's conscience through his fear of personal danger. We must make him feel that there is death in the air about him, that there is death in the pot before him, that there is death all around him." End quote. John Brown's raid was the emotional point of no return. It transformed a political conflict now into a holy war. For the South, it was now a war of survival. But for many in the North, it was now a righteous crusade. The middle ground, the age of compromises, had been burned away. By 1860, the nation stood on a precipice. The Democratic Party, that last great national political institution, finally shattered under the weight of the slavery issue. At their convention, Southern delegates walked out and the party split, and it nominated two separate candidates to be president. This fracturing of politics paved the way for one of the most consequential elections in American history. The 1860 presidential race featured four major candidates, a clear sign of a nation breaking apart. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois on a platform of halting slavery's expansion into the territories. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, still the champion and still championing popular sovereignty. The Southern Democrats nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge, who demanded federal protection for slavery everywhere. And the new Constitutional Union Party nominated John Bell, whose entire platform was essentially to ignore the slavery issue and beg for national unity. The result was a sectional victory. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, but he swept nearly every free state, giving him a clear majority in the Electoral College. To the South, his election was not a legitimate Democratic outcome. It was a hostile takeover by a purely sectional anti-slavery party. They saw it as the final proof that their way of life had no future in the Union. So we return to our central question then. Was the Civil War an irrepressible conflict or the product of a blundering generation? The blundering generation thesis suggests that better leadership could have forged another compromise, that the war was a tragic, avoidable failure of politics. But the events of the 1850s present a powerful counter-argument to that. The failure of the Compromise of 1850, the violence of Bleeding Kansas, the Supreme Court's radical Dred Scott decision, and the emotional firestorm from John Brown's raid, each event systematically dismantled the potential for political compromise. Each event revealed a chasm between North and South that was not merely political, but deeply moral and social and economic. As historian Eric Fauner has argued, the conflict was ultimately about two fundamentally incompatible social systems and their competing vision for the nation's future, one based on free labor and one on slave labor. By 1860, the conflict certainly seemed irrepressible. In December, just weeks after Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, declaring that the federal government had become its enemy. The House was now finally divided. After Lincoln was president-elect of a fractured republic, he had won the election, but he had lost half of the country. The time for debate, for compromise, for politics was over. The crisis had reached its peak. In our next episode, we'll cross the line from a crisis to conflict as we witness the first shots of the American Civil War. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.